Let's talk some Mets because Steve Cohen introduced this week, official press conference. He is the new owner of the New York Mets. A new era has come upon us in Flushing. And Mike, I had a few takeaways from his press conference, and I want to hear yours momentarily. But just from watching Steve Cohen talk and just the energy and the care that he carries, it already feels different from the Wilpons. And he hasn't spent a dime yet, to be honest. Yeah, I mean, the minute he got there, he laid off just about everyone in that front office, and rightfully so, because Brody Van Wagen, I thought, was the worst GM in baseball at the time. And he sent everyone packing and brought Sandy Alderson in as the president. But what I got from watching that press conference is that Steve Cohen is a Mets fan with money, and he's going to spend it. And I think we all knew that. And I think there was no doubt that that was going to be the case with Steve Cohen. But I really wanted to hear it in person. And I really wanted, if I was a Mets fan, I would have wanted to officially see that this is going to happen. And I think this press conference proved that they're not messing around. And I think that is great for baseball. Not only just for the Mets, but for baseball, because the New York market is critical to all sports because it is probably the biggest market in the world. And to have the Yankees alone is just massive because of their success. But to add the Mets to the equation and the way they're going to spend, and for the Mets to just be sharks in the market and be consistently competitive, that's going to be massive, not only for New York fans, not only for Met fans, but for the game of baseball as a whole. It makes the game better to have owners like Steve Cohen involved in the sport. And hopefully more people like Steve Cohen will be owners going forward, because as we saw with the Wilpons, it's not always like that. The Wilpons had no interest in putting anything into this organization. It was their primary source of business. For Steve Cohen, obviously, to be a guy who's worth $14 billion and have the pleasure to be able to do this for a team that you love, it's great to see. But my biggest takeaway from him being introduced was that the league needs more people like Steve Cohen in charge of baseball teams, because going forward, this Mets team, I have no doubts, is going to be a big player, not only in the free agent market, but just a big player in terms of competing for championships going forward because of the mindset, because of the energy, and because of the passion that Steve Cohen brings to this organization.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. There's a couple quotes that stuck out to me. He said, "It's not about making the money; it's about building something great." That would quote his words, and I think that really shows you where his mindset. And he also talked about how he's doing this for the fans, and that's his main priority, to give something back to the fans, because they've been without so much as Mets fans for so long. And I think those are things you rarely see from a person in his position. And if you're a Met fan, you got to be optimistic, and you're even more optimistic now that you re-signed Marcus Stroman. As soon as Steve Cohen gets in there, you think about action, and that's a huge move for the Mets, spending money. And so you're really optimistic as a Mets fan. It's a good time to be a Mets fan, and you really say that recently.
It certainly is. And you brought up Marcus Stroman. I'm going to get to him in a little bit, but I want to make a few more points about Cohen just in general, because I've said this on past shows, and I'll say it again right now. The most important thing that Steve Cohen can do is get the right people in charge, because I like Sandy Alderson. I think he's actually the perfect guy right now to be in charge of all this, because you need to have someone as an owner that you can trust. And listen, I don't think Sandy Alderson would be a great general manager by any means, and I don't think he was a great general manager. He was fine, and he did his job under limitations, of course, from the Wilpons, but I think Alderson's a perfect guy for the situation that they have now, because he's not a guy that is going to carry an ego, and he's a guy who's willing to help. He's going to be the top man. I was talking to Dave Spampanato about this before, but he's going to be that top guy on that ledge who's going to be essentially the one that they report to. Yes, Cohen's obviously in charge of everything, but Alderson's going to be in charge of hiring everyone. And if we know anything from Steve Cohen, they're going to go big fish hunting, not only in free agency, but in the front office. And that's the most important thing they can do. And I want to point to something here, because there's not really a ton of big names available that would be a good fit for the New York Mets this offseason. What I think the Mets should do, not necessarily should do, but what I necessarily think they are going to do is Theo Epstein's contract expires after this year in Chicago. And it's pretty much universally known that he's done after this year with the Cubs. Is there a better fit than Theo Epstein right now in New York? I don't know if there is right now. Epstein is a guy who we've seen do it in Boston. We see him do it in Chicago. And yes, he has soured out there eventually. But if Cohen is going to go big game hunting in the front office, I don't think there's many guys I'd rather have than Theo Epstein in charge. He won 2 World Series with the Red Sox. He finally ended the curse in Chicago. I think Epstein's a perfect fit for what Steve Cohen wants to do because he wants a guy who's universally respected in both markets, not only in baseball, but in the analytics department, which Theo Epstein certainly is. He wants a guy who can put the right people in charge, which Theo has certainly done in both places that he's worked with Tito and Joe Madden. And Theo Epstein is going to make a lot of money wherever he gets his new job. And, well, would you look at Steve Cohen, a guy who wants to spend all the money in the world on his toy in the New York Mets? I think it's a perfect fit. I think it's something that if the Mets are willing to be patient, which they should be because they want to do this right, which they haven't done in the past, I think waiting a year for Theo Epstein makes a lot of sense for the New York Mets.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think it would be a good move for Theo Epstein too. I mean, it would just be another notch on his resume to go and end this drought for the Mets that they've been in. And he's done it in Boston, like you said, in Chicago. If he went to New York and did it, you'd be looking at someone who many would consider maybe an all-time general manager. So that seems like it would also make sense on Theo Epstein's side for his next move as a general manager. So I think that's a really good point, and I definitely could see Steve Cohen waiting a year and then making that move.
And I think Sandy Alderson is okay in that role for this year because as long as you're not going to panic in year one and go out and just spend everything to prove everything, I think Steve Cohen's earned that trust with fans already because of just how incompetent the Wilpons were in terms of owning this franchise. It appears that Steve Cohen has gained the respect of Mets fans to say, hey, we're not going to go big spending, we're going to smart spend. Because I think there's a significant difference between the two. Just look at the Angels, for example. They've gone out and spent tons of money on Albert Pujols, Josh Hamilton, Anthony Rendon, and Mike Trout even. And again, not all those are bad moves. You extended the best player in the world right now. You signed one of the best third basemen in the game, but they haven't spent in places where they've needed to spend. I think Steve Cohen, like I said, the biggest thing he can do is get the right people in charge to spend in the right spots. Because if this Mets team is going to operate like when the Yankees went out and signed Jacoby Ellsbury and Brian McCann and all those guys, this team's going to be in trouble going forward because they're going to put themselves into bad contracts. The luxury tax is going to be an issue. And again, it doesn't seem like money's ever going to be an issue with Steve Cohen, but I don't care how you slice it. You just can't have so many big contracts at one time. The Mets need to spend in the right spots. And I think you need to get the right people in place to do that, to guide Steve Cohen to a point where you can essentially say, hey, this is where we need, this is what we need, and this is how we're going to spend all this money that you want me to spend. And listen, Theo Epstein has had problems spending money in the past. I'm not going to deny that. I mean, just look at Jason Hayward, Tyler Chatwood in Chicago, and Boston, Adrian Gonzalez and Carl Crawford are 2 examples of terrible expenditures by him. But he's a guy who gets it, and he's a guy who's won. He's a guy who knows the ins and outs of the game, and he's a guy who I think is also at the forefront of where baseball is going on top of that, which says a lot about Theo because he's been around the game for so long. It says a lot about his intelligence going forward. So assuming he's done in Chicago, I think that would be the perfect fit.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree, and I think that's where the Mets probably go in the new direction that Steve Cohen's going to take them. And I think what you also got to start thinking about is that do they start this offseason maybe picking up some new players, and where do they take this team to maybe make a playoff hunt? And Steve Cohen, the way he was talking, he seems that he wants success immediately. So it's going to be interesting to see how he molds this team or how he leads this team to maybe a potential playoff hunt. We'll see. It depends a lot of how this free agency plays out.
And I think that before we go to Stroman quick, I think that the Mets can spend this offseason even if they don't have the future GM or president of baseball ops in there, because I think Sandy Alderson is trustworthy enough in the position as just president and the overseer of all things that he can be the guy in charge for a year and spend, because we've seen what he can do in the past, and Steve Cohen clearly trusts him to do this type of stuff, in not just in adding personnel, but in terms of hiring people as well. So I think JT Realmuto should definitely be in play for the Mets this offseason, because catching is clearly a massive need. Trevor Bauer should be in play, also depending on the contract. And that's even without if Theo Epstein being here or whoever there decides their future GM. I just don't think the Mets should rush into committing to anyone as the future of their front office going forward, because we've seen that happen in the past, and it clearly failed miserably with Brody Van Wagenen.